Thank you. But does anyone else find the lighting really harsh in here? It's like, I feel like I'm about to go into surgery or something. So it's just nasty. Can I just start, who is in... yeah, is that better? Yeah, Lily. Okay. So who's in government? Who's in federal government here? 1, 2, federal government? Working for, okay. And then what about involved in state government? Are there many, yeah? Actually many Victorians here, or are you all interstate governments? Okay, yep, cool. All right, so let's get started. So I'm from the federal government, and I work for DEWA, the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations, and I'm a senior developer there. And so we're just going to talk a bit about our experience going from 0 websites to 6 websites in 6 months. So that's us, and we've got 5 ministers, which is quite a lot, and we've got 1 parliamentary secretary that we sort of work for. We've got 130 websites. Not many of those are in Drupal, only the 6 are in Drupal so far. We've got around 5,000 staff. We've got 18 web staff, which actually sounds a bit like an infection or something. I think it's like, you know, your blood results are back. I'm sorry to tell you, you have web staff. You'll need to take antibiotics for that. But anyway, we've got 18 of those. 9 of those are web publishers, which means they do the day-to-day content publishing sort of stuff, all the stuff you really don't want to do, so we don't have to do that. That's very nice. And then there's 9 web developers, which is our team, which there's 3 of the guys. Do you want to raise your hands just out the back there? Yeah, woo! The team there. The other half were supposed to be here, but they're sick. I don't know, they're flying back today, and I think it's probably not. I don't know. Anyway, so there's 9 of those, and it's kind of, we're a mix of developers, designers, business analysts, project managers, and testers, so we're not all developers. And there's 2 Dans in the team, and I'm one of those. Yeah, cool. So these are the websites that we've done in the last 6 months, and you'll note there's only 5 there. The reason being that one of them was done, but it didn't get approval to go live. It's just sitting there ready to go. It was actually the very first website we did in Drupal. So we did 6, but you know, due to bureaucracy, etc., it just hasn't gone live. But I'd encourage you to pop those open on your phones or your laptops during the presentation, and if you want to ask us any questions about them, feel free to at the end of the talk. So how did we get to where we are? It's been a bit of a journey, and it started in 2009, which was, I guess, the year of frustration, where we were using a CMS, which was SharePoint, and we just couldn't get it to do what we wanted it to do. So there were many issues, one of them being that you couldn't get it to do what you wanted to do. But also there were time factors, there were cost factors, and we just really weren't happy with what it was doing. So we were looking for something better, and that led us on to the year of meetings, where we were trying to convince people to move to a different platform. We hadn't picked Drupal at that stage, we just wanted to move to something better, but it took a whole year of convincing to actually get there. And then in 2011 they said, yeah, you can go for another CMS, take your pick. We did a proper assessment, and our choice ultimately ended up being Drupal, which is where we are today. And today I wanted to talk mostly about the meetings bit. It's not going to be that boring though, but like meetings, as in how did we actually get and convince people to move to Drupal? How did we convince our organisation, which is government, to move to Drupal? And one theory I've got is it was all about elevator pitches. And if you're not familiar with the elevator pitch, it's a 30-second to 2-minute spiel that you would do, in an elevator, perhaps, where you're having a conversation with maybe a prospective client, or if you're in government, like a head of department or something. We heard that you might be considering Drupal. Why do we care? Why not just stick with SharePoint? It works. And it's about that conversation that you have with people and trying to convince people to change, because change is hard, especially in government. So I'm going to break it down a bit, but a big sort of government pitch that I just whipped up this morning, it could be, Drupal will help your organisation build accessible, high quality, more feature-rich websites in a shorter amount of time, and you can do that at a lower cost than your content management system. So that's just one pitch that you could put, but I'm going to break that down during the presentation today. So the first pitch is harder, better, faster, stronger, which basically Drupal just does things a lot better than our current CMS did, previous CMS did. Yeah. So when you're pitching to people, they normally have a CMS already. And so what we were doing was really just contrasting the two and trying to prove how much better another CMS could be as opposed to our current one. So the first pitch in that you can make is about in cost. So SharePoint costs a lot of money, and it's not just licensing fees. It's the fees involved in hiring staff, and you've also got less choice in terms of vendors to go for. So because of also the time that SharePoint would take to develop a website, that would just cost us more money, right? We're paying staff all the time to do websites, and if you're delivering less websites, you're getting less for your money. So there's the obvious cost one. But it's also about needs. I mentioned it before, where SharePoint just wouldn't do what we wanted it to do. Sometimes it would take a really long time to do something, but other times it just wouldn't do what we wanted it to do. So that was a really big problem there. And the last one is time. So it took a long time to do websites in SharePoint as opposed to Drupal, which we found out in the last 6 months. And if we compare the two, in 6 months with SharePoint, we probably did 1 to 2 websites with the team that we've got. Whereas in Drupal, in the last 6 months, we've done 6 websites. And we're new to this as well. So when we started, none of us knew Drupal at the start of that 6 months. And now we know a little bit more about it. We're able to do 6 websites in 6 months. So imagine if we did another 6 months, we could do even more. So that's just a really easy metric to sort of use in your elevator pitch. And what we've done is we've changed the model, where with SharePoint, we're spending heaps and heaps of time just building new stuff, building stuff from scratch. You can see the reusing bit is really small. You probably can't even see it. So we did very little reusing of existing code or grabbing it from other organisations. So what we're looking to do, or what we have done, is we flipped that. So the first thing we do is we reuse existing functionality. And Drupal does that much better than SharePoint, because there's just so much more you can grab and just plug in to your CMS. And then the buy and the build obviously switched as well. So the last thing we do is we build. We do try and avoid just building from scratch if we can. If we can easily go out to an external vendor and get them to buy, to do that, we will. So the next pitch is that Drupal is open source. Well, duh. But why is that good? Why is that important? Because saying that a product is open source on its own isn't really a pitch. You need to kind of go into it a bit more. So the main thing around open source, you might first think to the cost value, because that is an issue. You do save money with Drupal because you don't have to pay licensing fees. But it's not necessarily just about that, because in government, money is a factor, but it's not always the #1 factor. And what you typically think of benefits with open source, you think of risk and about risk avoidance. And one of the things you might think is that, well, with Drupal, there's so many companies that offer support for it. If Acquia ever went bust, then it wouldn't matter. Drupal would continue. So that's one way to think of it. There's also the risk for us in that we couldn't deliver websites. So it would take us too long, or we couldn't deliver the functionality that we wanted to. So that's a big issue. But I think a better pitch is to flip it and is to talk about opportunity. And the opportunity that Drupal allows us to do, which is to deliver high quality websites in a shorter amount of time. And to over-deliver to our ministers in our department, I think is the main pitch in terms of open source. And so just a pitch there. Drupal's agility enables us to deliver high quality websites in a short amount of time, because its community allows us to choose from that large pool. So that's a large pool of companies, developers, and a functionality. And so that's all about choice. Or to put it another nicer way, there's a module for that. You've probably heard that before, and that's really true. So if a client comes to us and they want a particular feature, so hey, we want some forums or something like that. Oh, in SharePoint, okay, we can do it, but it'll take about a year to develop it, and it won't be as good. Or Drupal, sure, there's a module. We'll just grab it, we'll install it, done. So it really enables us to over-deliver on what we want to do. And I just want to take a small sidestep and talk about an anti-pitch, which is we've already got an open source CMS, which you might hear this. So when you're making the pitch in terms of open source, you might say, well, we've already got one. Or they might say, well, we're thinking about this other open source CMS, let's go for that. But you really need to make the analysis on what open source means to your organisation, not just open source is good. Well, why is it good for your organisation? And I wanted to compare 2 CMSs, Drupal and another CMS called Squiz Matrix. How many people have heard of Squiz Matrix? Wow, okay, good. So I should say, before I go on to this, I've got a bit of a background with Squiz Matrix, so there's a bit of a story there. So if any opinions come out here, they're my opinions, not necessarily the opinions of the federal government. But anyway, I just wanted to contrast the two. And the reason I picked Squiz Matrix also is because it's very widely installed in federal and state government. In fact, probably more widely than Drupal. And it claims to be an open source CMS. So one of the factors, service companies. So companies you can get in to assist you with developing websites, configuring, developing modules, whatever it is, support, training. Squiz Matrix, as far as I know, there's less than 5 worldwide. Drupal, you've got at least 15 in Australia. So big choice there, especially if you're in government, you're going out to tender or request for quote, you've got a lot more choices. Therefore, it's more competitive. And we talked about that risk. You're avoiding the risk. If you've got more companies that you can potentially go to, if you get sick of one or they go bust, you've still got those choices. The next metric is advanced users. So by this I mean people that know the software really well and you could potentially hire. Because if you're running Drupal, you're going to want to hire Drupal staff because you have staff turnover, etc. And there's a lot more of them in Drupal than there is in Squiz Matrix. If you've ever tried to hire good Squiz Matrix staff, you might have found that difficult. The next metric is external contributors. So we're talking about the benefits that you get from open source. And some of the benefits are innovation, because you've got so many people looking at your code. I think Dimitri was talking about this earlier. So many different people are looking at your code, and you can innovate in that way, and you can provide interesting solutions to things. There's also the reported benefit of higher quality code, and that can sometimes directly translate to security. So if you have all these people looking over your code, you're going to have higher quality code, and it's going to be more secure, in theory. Now with Squiz Matrix, you have less than 5 external contributors to the software, whereas with Drupal, if you include modules, you've got around 14,000. So you're not necessarily getting the benefit of open source if you don't have that large community. The next one, just an interesting metric, forum posts. The Squiz Matrix forums have been around since 2004 to do a fair comparison, but there's less than 50,000 forum posts. Drupal, you've got over 1 million. I don't know when it hit 1 million, but I think it was fairly recently. So not only are you're more likely to get responses to your questions on the forums, you've got a much larger pool of forum posts to pick from. Okay, so if you're looking for how to install the software, even just learning, you've got more free and easily available resources than you do with Squiz Matrix. And finally, books. Squiz Matrix, you've got 1 because I wrote the stupid thing. And Drupal, you've got 360 on Amazon alone, okay? So if you want to learn the software, you don't have to pay a vendor a lot of money for some expensive training. You can just get some books. And those books are going to have critical opinions of the software and say, well, this thing works well, but you could do it better this way. So I just think it's a really interesting comparison between the two. So if you get the line, we've already got an open source CMS, make sure you do this sort of comparison. Anyway, that's it for the rant. So, in 6 months, we're able to do 6 websites. That's great. But here's all the modules we used. And these are things that we might have just got requests for, and we're just like, oh, okay, well, we'll just grab that and stick it in. And it's great. That's what we want. So the next pitch is that Drupal produces accessible websites. And it does. I think that's a fair thing to say. There are probably some caveats on it, but generally out of the box, it produces pretty accessible websites. And I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. But why is that important? Well, it's because of something called the National Transition Strategy. And who's familiar with that National Transition Strategy? Not many. Okay, cool. Matt put his hand up, didn't you? Of course you know about it. So it's a federal mandate that's also gone statewide now that says by the end of this year, all our websites must be WCAG 2.0 single A compliant. And by the end of 2014, they must be WCAG 2 AA compliant. So it's obviously very important to us because it's mandated. We have to do it. And so not only do we have those 130 websites we have to make AA compliant, if we're building any new websites, of course we want to make them AA compliant because we don't want to have to go back and retrofit our sites to make them accessible. I mean, they should be accessible anyway, but because of this, we have to do it. And I think it's something that we'd like to see in terms of quotes. So if you are working for the government, you're contracting, you want to include this stuff. If you say, okay, we're going to build you this module to do this functionality, you should say, and by the way, we understand your needs as per the National Transition Strategy. and we guarantee that it will be WCAG 2 AA compliant. Because not only is that what you should be doing, it's a really good pitch to make. I mean, imagine if there's 10 quotes and you're the only one that says that. That's going to put you ahead. So it's something that you really need to do. I think it's also important to ideally go beyond accessibility and not just check the boxes and say, you know, we're actively working to improve the accessibility of Drupal. We understand your requirements and that sort of thing. I just think it's really important and something that is perhaps lacking at the moment. So in terms of Drupal and accessibility, as I said, it's accessible out of the box. In terms of our experience, most of the issues we come across occur at the template level. And by that I mean, so we're running the Boron theme on most of our sites. It's just a simple theme. It's got a couple of nice accessibility things in it. And we add those through a sub-theme, which uses the HTML5 boilerplate. But most of the issues that we see are sort of in the template PHP or in your template files where we've added something and you know, it's caused some accessibility issues. When we do find accessibility issues in other modules, we make sure we log them. Because if we're talking about the reported benefits of open source and we're making that pitch, we want Drupal to be as accessible as possible, because if we're working with it and we're trying to sell it, then you want it to be as accessible as possible. We also benefit from it because we're running websites using Drupal and we need to meet our requirements. Module developers, in my experience, have been pretty good about that, especially if you supply patches. And just the last point I'd like to make is that I've seen a couple of times where I found an accessibility issue, say it's in core, and I've gone to log it and I found that it's actually already been fixed, but it's been fixed in Drupal 8 and not Drupal 7. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong at the end of this, but as far as I'm aware, if a code change is going to affect HTML output, it won't necessarily get backported to Drupal 7. But that can be a problem if you want Drupal to be as accessible as possible. You might be running Drupal 7 and you can't get those benefits until Drupal 8. So it's probably a good idea to check what's going into Drupal 8 in terms of accessibility fixes, and then you can try and backport them yourself. You don't necessarily have to do, you know, a core hack. You can probably just do theme overriding for most of them, hopefully. Cool, so back to our pitch. Drupal produces accessible websites, so out of the box it does, and that helps us meet the requirements of the National Transition Strategy. But the more important thing is that its community is actively working to improve accessibility, because in terms of assessing CMSs, if you had one that said, yes, we're WCAG 2 and just check, versus if you have one that says, we meet WCAG 2, check, and we're doing all these things to improve accessibility, you would pick the latter. Because just checking a box, I mean, they could fudge the figures. They could just, everything could be turned off and yes, it's accessible, but it doesn't do anything. So the fact that it's an active community, I think really helps sell Drupal. So again, in 6 months, we're able to deliver 6 websites that were all WCAG 2 AA compliant. So yay for us. And the final pitch I wanted to make is that these guys did it in terms of us. I mean, you know, we're not the greatest, but we did it. We moved from SharePoint to Drupal. We had no Drupal experience when we started out. We built 6 websites. You could use this as a case study if you wanted to. Okay, you know, these guys did it. So DEWA has moved 6 of their websites to a cloud-based Drupal platform, and this year we'll move their main website, dewa.gov.au, to the same system. So especially if you're in government and you're working with another similar size department, you could say, well, these guys have done it and it's working well for them, so why don't you consider it? And we're not the first either. So, you know, there's a list of Drupal websites that run Drupal in federal government, so check those out as well, and those would be good case studies as well. And so I wanted to talk the last part of the talk about how we did certain things and how we've got to where we are. I think the first important point is that we've built a good team, and that's something I take no credit for. But we've hired not necessarily Drupal developers. We hired people that just were good designers or were familiar with web standards and accessibility. They knew how to build good websites. They were willing to learn. They knew, you know, some web programming. They might have known PHP, but maybe not. And that just really base foundation skills has helped us build the good team and the websites that we do build. Also, building a good development environment is important, because you want your developers to be happy so that they don't leave, and so that they build good websites. You know, you don't want a disgruntled developer building a website for you. And you know, it also retains staff, and hopefully, because they are in a good environment, they talk to their friends, and they also want to work in that environment. You know what I mean? So It's kind of a nice positive cycle that you build. And so obviously you're going to want to do version control. This might be obvious to everyone, but if we didn't have version control, we would go nuts. We have some nice dev, test and prod environments that we use, and we've got a nice deploy system, which Kim Pepper is talking about later today, I think. That's the Capistrano one. And we also do automated testing. So when we push changes out to our test environment, we run a bunch of Selenium tests, so we know how many things we've broken or fixed. And so in terms of how we do other stuff, we do responsive design, and that seems to be a very popular talk at the conference. So I won't go into it too much because you'll probably be sick of it soon. But just a very specific example, if you don't know what responsive design is, this is the first website that we did it in. This is the Freedom of Information website, and that's the desktop view. You move down, and as you get to smaller devices, you get a more optimized experience. But the reason I wanted to talk about this, and it'd be interesting to see how the other responsive design talks handle it, is that I think we can do better than this. I think we can do responsive design. That's a word, shut up. So, and what we're using, if you're familiar with it, is Andy Clark's 320 and up. Has anyone heard of that? Show of hands? A couple of people. Andy Clark's 320 and up framework? No? Okay. Well, that's the URL if you're interested. And it's what he calls responsively responsive. So the traditional responsive design is you start with your desktop design, and you then apply, you go, oh, okay, we want it to work on iPhones. So you apply another style sheet which works in your specific iPhone and specific resolutions. But what that means is they have to download the full desktop version plus additional style sheets and then work their way down. And what about, user agents that don't support media queries, or what about, really old phones? And case in point, the Nokia 3210, which I'm sure a few of you have in your pockets right now, the website on the left is the FOI site, and that's the one that we've used the traditional responsive design where you do the desktop first and then you apply additional style sheets. The one on the right is using the 320 and up framework, and what you're seeing there is just a handheld style sheet. But the way it works, if you then had an iPhone one, it would download the handheld plus the 320, and if you have an iPad, it would download the handheld and the 320 and the iPad. So you're downloading less CSS than you need to, and you're also applying less CSS overrides, okay? So basically, it's more than just doing a desktop design and then thinking about iPhone. You're covering a much wider range of devices. There's less CSS to download and process, it works on more devices, and it is actually minimal extra effort. It's kind of changing the way you think about things a little bit in terms of how you design, but it's not that much more effort. So I'm kind of like, well, it's a better way of doing things, why aren't we doing it? So that's what we've done. So all our sites now do this. Therefore, as I mentioned, is using the old style, but we'll hopefully convert it one day. But all the others should use this similar kind of framework. And I just think it's a better way of doing it. So that's the end of rant number 2. Accessible video, we are doing some of that. Basically, we haven't found a module in Drupal that does accessible video to the level that we need it to be, which is WCAG 2 AA at least. We want to do it better than that. So what we want to do is HTML5 and Flash video. And we also want to provide downloads for that. Obviously, you don't want to just do Flash video because not everyone has Flash. We want to do captions for HTML5, which we have a very nice polyfill, which Chris, go on, put your hand up. There he is. Chris actually wrote Captionator for us and for the world. So feel free to ask him any questions about that. And I suppose people should go to Sylvia Pfeiffer's talk on accessible video if you're interested in that. Just ignore what I've said and just go to that instead. One of the specific problems we've come across, which I think Chris is working on, is the issue of keyboard operation and keyboard traps. So in WCAG 2, it says that if someone's using a keyboard to navigate, the interface needs to be fully operational, so play, pause, fast forward, etc. But there shouldn't be any keyboard traps. So when you tab into something and then you can't get out of it, well, sometimes we have that in certain user agents. So that's just a minor example of the kind of things we're trying to fix. So in terms of the next 6 months, we're working on the big one, ziwa.gov.au. And I'm really glad that we didn't work on that first, in terms of not knowing Drupal and just going for the big one. I'm glad we've got the 6 websites under our belt. The site's sort of got 100 topics or sections to it, so it's a reasonable site. It's got around 10,000 pages and 35,000 files. So if you have any ideas for us on how we can do that too, feel free to let us know. And we're doing it all in Drupal. Yay! That's nice. So feel free to talk to us about some stuff. What's happening in federal government. I don't mean politically wise, I mean websites. I've got no idea about that. Cloud hosting in Australia, we have some opinions on that, which we can share privately. Video captioning and accessibility, definitely talk to Chris about that. And if you want to know what kind of modules and themes that we are using just to kind of get ourselves off the ground, let us know. And you can talk to Adam about Iron Man and Ghostbusters and Transformers. So thanks very much. And I think we'll have questions, and I might possibly defer to these guys for some of them, just in case I don't know the answers to. Yep.
Thanks very much. Could you just talk a little bit more about the automated testing?
Sure.
Yeah.
How did I get onto it? I think I saw a screencast of The Economist doing automated testing with Selenium. So we were just looking for something that we wanted to do because with our kind of deployment system, you can test it on your dev environment, but you don't sort of know functionally site-wide whether you've broken something, right? So you're changing a theme or you're changing one small part of a module, but how do you know that there's some interdependency that you don't kind of know about? So that was my main concern, and we've only been doing it quite recently. But basically what we do is in our version control, we have a folder which just has a bunch of Selenium tests, the HTML version. So we kind of just record those using the Firefox tool and use those to kind of test the bit of functionality that we're using. So what I'm hopefully thinking we'll do is kind of move to almost a test-driven development sort of thing, but with Selenium testing. So you build a bit of functionality, and before you deploy that in, you also include a test, so that as the website's developing, you know, 99 out of 100 tests passed, but this one failed, and why did it fail? We're not using Hudson or anything like that. We probably could, but we just haven't got there yet. It's just a small PHP script that actually just runs the test for us. It records a bit of video too, and then you just get an email. So our deployment system, so we use GitHub, and then you can use the post hook kind of command to send that out to this PHP script that we've got. That kind of records the video, does the test, and then just shoots you an email and say, congratulations, no tests failed. Yeah.
Can you just describe Selenium for the people that might know?
Hang on, who was it? Who asked the question?
Sorry, let's just repeat the question.
I just thought there'd be a few people that aren't familiar with Selenium, and a little bit of background might extend that.
I don't know. Who else would want to describe it? I mean, the specific use that we have, I guess, is it allows you to run a bunch of commands, but it's not like programming unit testing. It kind of allows you to interact with a user agent. So like when we run it in a headless environment, but what it does is it goes, all right, I want you to load up this web page, I want you to click this link, and I want you to look for this text. And you can, there's a whole lot of kind of programming you can stick and tests you can stick into it. But the thing I like is that using the Firefox plugin, you can just record those actions. So you hit record, you do a couple of clicks, and you just alter the kind of test a little bit, and then that's your test, and you just commit that in. So that's my attempt at Selenium. There's probably a lot more you can look it up. Yeah.
Thanks. Can you give us a bit of an idea of the topography of the department? Apologies if I missed it earlier on. Are you guys from the IT department of the department,
No, that's
or from one of the business branches?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I probably should have mentioned it. So we're actually from the communications area. So we've got a big IT sort of group, and we're not part of that. And they were the ones doing the SharePoint development. And we were the ones actually driving the change. We were saying, hey, IT, this isn't good enough, we want to do better. And I guess it's an interesting point to make, because if you are trying to approach the department and you're not having luck with the IT section, you could actually approach the comms section, because they're the ones that kind of are concerned with the end result instead of the technology. So yeah, we're from comms as opposed to traditional IT. Yep.
When it came down to making the pitch for Drupal to whoever you had to pitch to, what was the most difficult thing about pitching Drupal? Like, what was it up against? What did it come down to? Or was it just Drupal from the start for you guys?
Yeah. Matt, do you reckon you would feel like? This is Matt Andrews, our technical manager. think that's, yeah.
Basically, you know, Dan's touched on many, many issues that came up in the discussions that we had. But to be honest, the biggest trigger that we had and the thing that drove the change more than anything else was the accessibility aspects. SharePoint was such a fail on that it made it a lot easier for us to sell the rest of the advantages.
Were there any challenges in presenting Drupal? Like, did you run into any problems in saying, you know, any, I guess, yeah, just any challenges in trying to pitch Drupal to them?
I don't think we ever hit a serious roadblock in terms of significant technical challenges or obviously cost and so forth. It's nice to be in a situation where we're comparing an existing product that has so many obvious problems against Drupal, and imagine in plenty of other situations you'd have a much stronger incumbent product, and that would make it more difficult. But no, we really didn't have many problems other than inertia.
Thank you, Matt.
I'm just wondering how you guys approach questions of like architecture and system design, because there seems to be somewhat of a vacuum around Drupal in terms of like methodologies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Matt. Do you want to answer that one as well?
Who's going to? I guess what I can say about that is that we started very much on a small scale basis, looking at a single server running everything for a given site. So database, monitoring, web server, proxy, everything on a single server. And we haven't yet hit the point where we've needed to split that up and move into a more sophisticated architecture, but we're pretty rapidly hitting that point. So we're about to shift to a situation where we're likely to have at least one database server, multiple web servers, and a separate level of load balancing and proxying. Around that, we've got a heap of different monitoring and provisioning in terms of deployment and that sort of stuff. Is that the kind of level you're asking about, or? Oh, yeah. Another aspect, I suppose, is that we started with a really vanilla setup, which was Apache and MySQL. And we've shifted over to Nginx, and we've had lots of beneficial results from that change.
It's nice that you're taking the positive, and this presentation is about how Drupal succeeded in meeting your needs. But of course, that can be turned around to say that these other things didn't meet your needs, as you've said fairly directly. How does the federal department get away with that? Because honestly, you know, I've been in IT a long time, and I'm from Canberra, and it's very rare to hear someone be so direct about MS products not working.
Yep.
At a podium.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's even rarer to say that, you know, something like Drupal has been so successful. So,
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I'm really quite surprised that your department would let you make this presentation. Is that just me, or was there an issue?
No, it wasn't an issue, and I guess part of that is, you know, we're from a comms area, so we're okay with that sort of thing. And I think we wanted to shake things up. We wanted to change things because, you know, a reasonable amount of money was being spent on software that we thought we weren't getting our money's worth out of. And we didn't necessarily have direct control because, as you know, not being in IT, it was harder to pitch directly to them, you know what I mean? They wouldn't listen to us as much. Do you guys want to add? You had another? Yeah.
I think that's really important what you just said about being from the comms area, because what's driven it in our area, and I won't tell you where I'm from right now, but it is it is a very large federally funded organization.
Yeah.
Marketing is
Yeah.
what changed it in ours.
Yeah.
Had to get away from the IT area, and marketing did it. So, yeah.
Yeah, because it's about the end result. It's not just about the product. Yeah.
You mentioned about moving the Drupal sites to cloud-based Drupal platform. Is that Australian-based?
Yeah, I probably won't mention specific vendors, but it is Australian-based. And that's important for us because most of our users are obviously from the Australian government, right? So, sorry, from Australia. So in terms of localities, we don't necessarily want our service to be hosted in the US in terms of the latency.
Yeah, I think there should be a policy saying that all the hosting should be Australian-based.
Well, yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah. And in terms of, in terms of CDNs as well, I guess we're interested in that too, because we might have users that are in, remote or regional Australia, who they're not going to be near the big data centres in Sydney and Melbourne. So.
And also, would it be possible? Is it possible for you to tell us what's the hosting company is?
Yeah, come talk to us afterwards. I think probably the best way to do it. Yeah.
Okay,
there's not that many in Australia anyway.
Oh, sorry, I just got a last question.
Yeah.
And also, the last question is the the for video hosting.
Yeah.
What's the federal government's strategy? Is it in-house hosting, or it's better to use some third-party solutions like YouTube?
Yeah, I guess I can't speak for all of the federal government because I'm just working for one department. We seem to do a bit of a combination of sort of socially hosted videos and hosting videos on our own website, and sometimes that can be due to kind of speed. Like if SharePoint was having an issue and we couldn't host it, then they would kind of stick it on YouTube. But I don't know, I probably couldn't speak for everyone. The advantage we have of hosting it ourselves is that we can do probably more accessible video than, say, someone like YouTube might offer. We can make sure everything's kind of there. But I guess a way to get around the National Transition Strategy, if it is hosted on YouTube, then is it really your site, and do you have to meet WCAG too? Like, there's a bit of a grey area there.
So what's the strategy now? Is it half-half, or is it mixed, or is it going to a certain direction?
I think it depends on the context. If we were doing a campaign that wanted to be largely socially driven, then we might host a lot more videos on Vimeo or YouTube or something like that. So I think it really depends.
And can I follow up on that question and ask why you ended up going with a kind of DIY solution for video instead of using a video management platform like, say, Kaltura or something?
Yeah. Do you feel like answering that, Chris? Okay, reluctantly.
Well, it's changed a lot. The landscape's changed a lot. Back when we started having to deploy a lot of videos on our new platform, Kaltura wasn't that mature. It didn't offer a lot of the accessibility things that we need. In fact, it still doesn't offer a lot of the accessibility features that we need as part of HTML5. So that's why we did it DIY. And we're actively working with the W3 on developing a lot of the standards as they come about. So as far as like captioning and assistive tracks and that kind of thing, we feel doing it by ourselves is probably more advantageous at this stage, but that doesn't rule out going to something like Kaltura in the future.
Yeah, I've got two questions about WCAG 2.0 compliance. Number one, did you declare internally, did you self-test that, or were you tested by an external body, albeit within the department? And number two, what were your primary testing validation methods?
Sure. In regards to the first question, it's been a bit of a mix. So we do have an accessibility unit, which I think has one person in it, and they're part of IT, and so they'll often do some testing for us, and that's good because they're kind of abstracted from the site. Our first site, we got an external consulting company to do an accessibility audit for us, and I think that was good just to get a different perspective on things that we might have been missing. And it also, parts of WCAG are unfortunately a little bit subjective, so it's good to get different opinions and views on that. Largely, before we go live with a website, we have to complete audit documents that say, we've tested it and these are all the checkpoints and here's all the notes in regards to it. I'll generally do things mostly manually. I don't think there's any specific tools we recommend. Internally, I think in the department we have Total validator. I don't know whether we use that much or are that keen on it, but largely we just use a bunch of debugging kind of tools, you know, like the web developer toolbar, or you know, Firebug, or the web inspector tools in WebKit, stuff like that. And I mean, I just go through each checkpoint and I kind of read all the possible mistakes you can make, and then we generally have a couple of people go over it as well. So at the moment it is very, very manual. And Matt's signalling to me.
Well, sorry, just for a moment. The department's actually kind of gone beyond WCAG 2 as it's outlined in the standards, because there's so much that's really open to interpretation. If you're trying to get to a specific, you know, hit or miss result, you won't necessarily get that without a whole lot of argument. Just from the WCAG 2 standard. So the department's produced an internal document which is basically saying, this is the policy, this is how you need to meet this. So it's kind of like the WCAG 2 extended version. And we are kind of moving to a point where we validate against that, as opposed to WCAG, just the original document.
Yeah, I think there's a few AAAs in there that we sort of say that we must do as well, as part of that policy.
Do any of your 6 websites have to interact with legacy SharePoint systems in terms of retrieving data?
Nope. Nope.
Yeah, I was just wondering what development methodology you used and if that was new to you guys. And then also you talked about videos and sort of a social aspect. Do you have any user-generated content? And how do you handle that between your development and test environments when you're adding new features to a site?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So, sorry, what was the first one again? It was about...
development methodology.
Okay, yeah. I don't think we have a specific methodology. Like, I think you could call us agile, definitely, but we kind of... We're still working on that too, because it is a process. We've only been doing it for 6 months, and we're kind of finding out what works. Like the Selenium testing, for example, that's only been in there for a month or so. So I think we're still working on that. We're still, I don't know whether we're waterfall. We're certainly agile in some of the ways we do it. I guess an important distinction to make is we develop new websites and then we kind of hand them off too. So it's not often that we'll launch a website and then we'll have to build additional functionality in there. So that kind of puts us in a different perspective. Test-driven development was the, I mean, I guess, like I said, we're looking to do sort of that. Not test-driven development in the classic sense where you know, each function has its own sort of test, but you know, with the Selenium testing, that's kind of towards that model. And the second question was about accessible. I think Adrian would be a really good one to answer that. What do you say? Oh, there he is. Hey, Adrian, come on down. Oh, sorry. In terms of user-generated content, how do we?
Well, for most of our sites, we don't have a lot of user-generated content at this point in time, and everything typically just happens on prod at the moment. We're not, we don't do, we do backups and stuff, obviously, but nothing to and from prod to dev for user content.
Lots of questions.
You mentioned through your 2010 meetings, there are quite a few things that you couldn't do in SharePoint that you can now do in Drupal. Can you elaborate on those items?
Adrian. We probably couldn't elaborate too much. I mean, I actually started in 2011, so I missed all of the SharePoint stuff. In fact, I don't think I'd be working for DWA if we did use SharePoint. I don't know that we could go into too many specific cases. I think maybe one of them was to do with users registering, and that was quite a significant and complicated thing. Part of that could be to do with the way our environment is set up too. So, you know, there might be environments that use SharePoint really well, but the way it was implemented and we use it, it certainly wasn't working for us. So, yeah, just one example I think was we wanted to do let users register, and it was really difficult. It wasn't doable in SharePoint. So, yeah, sorry, that's not that specific, but that's probably the best I can do for now. Yeah.
I heard last year. Sorry,
oh, hey, there you go.
Hi. I heard last year that DIA was going to set up a repository for all their documents. So I'm wondering, was that part of this? How are you coping with PDFs and have you got a strategy for not losing links and URLs and permanent URLs?
Yeah, I think that you might be talking about the Freedom of Information website. No? Not.
It was DIA.
Okay, yep, great. I think we're looking for advice on those sorts of things. It's definitely a concern of ours with the 35,000 sort of files that are going in, and especially PDFs aren't the most accessible things. Ideally, we would like to have all HTML pages, but just the amount of content that we have makes that really difficult, and just the limited resources that we have makes it difficult to convert all those. So I think it's just something we're looking for advice on in terms of developing this new site. I don't think I have any specific solutions for you, sorry.
All right, we're coming to an end. I've got one last question.
He's already asked
me. Just got a short question about the backup strategy. What kind of backup strategy do you have?
It's a great one. It backs things up, and sorry, could you give it to Matt? I mean, one thing I should mention, I guess, is we do use the backup and migrate module, and that's often what we'll do because, and I'm sure everyone's come across the problem where we've got code changes being pushed from dev to test to prod, but then you've got content changes which kind of need to go back the other way. So often what we'll do is we'll just grab a backup and migrate from the production database and just stick it on to dev, on your dev environment, and then you've got like a replication of prod. So I guess we'd like to automate that a bit more, but yeah.
Well, basically, I suppose you can divide what we deliver to our production servers into two halves, and one half is really controlled directly by a source control system, and so that's themes, modules, and the other half of it is really stuff that potentially is coming in from the outside world, so that's the database and the uploaded files. So what we've got is a kind of a very frequent backing up of the database and files. On some sites that happens hourly or several times a day. Onto the same machine, is shipped off to other machines and remotely. And then we've got cross-server backups that get a snapshot of the whole machine and encrypt that and send that up to the cloud. So we've got sort of multiple dimensions to the backups, I guess. Separately from that, we've got, as Dan mentioned, backup and migrate, manual backups just to use for pushing stuff around between prod and test and dev.
So you guys actually back up everything, including the content? Hang on,
you're not talking to this.
I'm saying the backup actually covers everything, including the content, because all those contents are pretty huge, especially for federal government websites. There are hundreds gigabytes of content, I assume.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So everything?
Yep.
Okay.
Cool. That's it.
Sorry, guys.